Thanks everybody that could make the webinar in person. We're going to run through a strategic planning workbook webinar. And what we'll do is this will be recorded and posted on the website by tomorrow. So if anybody that could not make it, will be able to review it at that time. As I said earlier, we're focusing on a strategic plan workbook, knowing that many communities truly struggle with how to manage and effectively update their strategic plan. We found that a workbook may be a viable solution for what the communities need. And so we pulled together and prepared a strategic plan workbook based off of the numerous communities worth of strategic plans we've completed. And we're hoping that this will be a step-by-step process that each one of your communities can undertake on your own. Or if you do need assistance, we're always available to answer questions, review information, or give you guidance on that accordingly. But we hope that this is a self-sufficiency tool that will provide the opportunity for each Main Street to update and manage their strategic plan accordingly. So what is strategic planning? Especially in the Main Street realm, this is where you start talking about what is your organization going to do over the next 2, 3, up to about 5 years. And this is where your board really needs to take a hard look at your vision, your mission. And that is the strong base point. It's important to move forward from that point on, though, and have actionable goals where you have supportive strategies and detailed annual plan elements included. Through this workbook, the hope is that each Main Street would be able to not only understand what assets are available in their community, but also set the big ideas, where the board's going to go over the next 5 years, and help create the annual work plans. Oftentimes, after working in communities, the strategic plan is a great working tool, but the downside is many times people have an opportunity where they feel that they're missing the annual work plans because there's no process step to get the individuals or the committees that are working to undertake that portion of the effort. Through the strategic planning process, it's about a phased approach. Through the phased approach, it's going to give you a dynamic opportunity to provide clarity to what you're doing and have adequate coordination. We'll also provide flexibility in how, when, and where you perform this strategic planning process. And it will hopefully end up with a comprehensive strategic plan that your board can start to adopt and put together the action items starting from day one. Based on this, the workbook has 2 essential response times. There's one that we call the rapid response track, and the other one is called slow and steady. Rapid response is meant for the communities that need to get it done quickly. It's basically set up where you could handle this strategic plan update in the course of about 2 half-day sessions with the public or with your board. This is a very condensed form, but you get the same content, the same process, the same worksheets. It's just a very labor-intensive process. The second option is what we call the slow and steady track. This is typically where it's at 30 to 45 minutes for 4 to 5 of your monthly board meetings. The purpose behind this one is to have this be kind of your annual update process, or every 2 to 3 years, you can use the same workbook, go through the same sheets, and have the slow and steady track take over and update your strategic plan accordingly. The workbook is set up where the same items you follow the same process. It's just a matter of how quickly you need to get this done. When you think about preparing a strategic plan, it is often about breaking things into phases or chunks. Just like the old Main Street adage, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. You complete your strategic plan one step or one phase at a time. This includes going through the process where we have 8 phases, and which we'll start with phase 0, which really isn't a phase, but it's just about having your pre-workshop activities done. The pre-workshop is about reviewing your previous plans, conducting your surveys, reviewing the efforts of what's done, what's worked, why it hasn't maybe worked, and understanding what roadblocks you hit along the way. This pre-work is really important to make sure that you've got a good, strong foundation for understanding what the community has experienced, what's been successful, and what has not been successful. Through this workbook process, you're going to have a workbook that would have each one of these phases broken out, and each phase would have a series of action items, step-by-step processes that the Main Street director would undertake, or the board president, whoever is in that role for your organization, a process that they would take. and they would go through, followed by a series, a subchapter of all the worksheets, questionnaires, forms, and documents that you were going to need in order to make this process successful. The hope is that this workbook for each phase would kind of serve as a one-stop shop for all the documentation you need and have everything ready for you. As for the end of phase 0, it's important to understand that all these items are typically done prior to the strategic planning process. So there's things you would conduct 2 to 3 weeks before. You would conduct a couple of surveys, talk with your board members about a week out, and then a couple of days ahead of time, you would start tabulating all these responses, look for themes and strategies on how that would move forward. As far as the first phase, so we call this the first phases are 1, 2, and 3. Those are the early phases of the process. The early phases of the process mean that it is basically you're going through the asset mapping, your opportunities and constraints process, of which you're trying to go through and understand what is available to you, what's available locally, and how that transpires. Again, this first couple of phases of the effort are broken down into what we call the early phase. Phase 1 is this plan review, where as a group, the community goes together and reviews all the plans and the strategies, what has worked with the last strategic plan, what has not worked, and you conduct these efforts as a group. Now, this may seem redundant because the director has already done this, but the important thing here is that you're building consensus among people that are in the board or in a working committee role, telling you what has worked or has not. So having an opportunity to collectively review these as a group is a really important step to make sure everybody understands what successes or failures were found and what were the driving factors behind them. This phase typically takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete, especially if you have an engaged board who already knows what the strategic plan is. Phase 2 is about asset planning. Asset planning is where the group will sit down together in small groups and consolidated efforts and identify both physical and human assets that are in the community. The physical and human assets are truly about what finances do you have and what volunteers do you have available to you. At this time, you can also look at things like cultural assets, recreational assets, and linking those items together. But going through and understanding what you have available is a critical first step before you want to go into planning those assets. So you need to do a good job of identifying everything you've got in the community. Sometimes this means working with more than the board. This may be one of those exercises that you take out to your Rotary, your chamber, your elected officials, all the other individuals in the community that make up this community. The important thing here, though, is that you conduct a comprehensive list of assets that are available to the community. These assets are the things that are going to make your Main Street feel different than every other Main Street. So going through and categorizing them, understanding what they are, what timing is needed, all the other elements that go with asset planning, having it listed in a comprehensive form will help with the next stages of the process. Phase 3 is the opportunity constraints listing. Each type of asset typically has limitations. These limitations are opportunities or constraints. They could be fiscal, they could be time, they could be bound by certain requirements. In order to understand how you can program the assets, it truly is critical to understand what their opportunities and constraints are. The third phase is about identifying, categorizing the constraints and seeing what opportunities that provides. Through this process, the community and the Main Street can start to conduct and finish the asset mapping exercises and understand what items they are to consolidate it into a concise and succinct list of assets that you can use during your strategic planning process and ways to make your community uniquely identifiable. That wrapped up the first phase of the early phase or planning portion of the process. The next one is what we call the middle phase. This is where you start to set your big ideas and you redefine or help define your mission and vision statements. This middle term phase starts with phase 4, where you start to update your mission and your vision. When you update these items, it's typically not a major overhaul. Sometimes there are changes that need to be done. Sometimes there are not. What's meant by this phase 4 of mission and vision update is to review these items and assess whether or not they are critical to be updated. As you go through this process of updating your mission and vision, this is not the time to worry about the wording and nitpick all the other items. This is the time to make sure the overall message that is being presented by these mission and vision items to be in alignment with where the organization is going over the next 5 years. A lot of communities do not necessarily update these regularly. However, it is important to do so on a fairly regular basis, about every 5 years, to at least review them and make sure they are concurrent with where the organization is going, has been, and where you want to go in the future. So in phase 4, you would look at crafting any updated statements, refining, and most importantly, voting, because almost never does everybody agree on what the wording should be. And then you have documentation and approval. This process has worksheets, plans, forms, and tables that can be filled out by the boards and the communities that can actually go through and understand what everybody's thinking, write it all down on paper, and then vote on it accordingly. As Main Street is a democratic process, it's important to understand that the majority of the votes will win this process. Phase 5 is what we call big ideas. This is actually our company's favorite time. There's one of the prep things that happens for this strategic planning process is people, before they get to the room and start talking, is they have to come up with a couple of big ideas. These big ideas are really important to helping the community understand what the board envisions for the future. So as one of the prep works from phase 0, each participant will create a sheet of 2 to 3 what they call big ideas. Then during the presentation, it's about writing these on the big sticky notes. It's amazing how excited people get about putting these on sticky notes and putting them on a wall. Then everybody kind of steps back and then you look at them as a group. You start to combine them into your four organizational committees of economic vitality, design, organization, and promotion. And if your community is in consensus, you're likely going to see many of these sticky notes say something very similar. This is also the opportunity where you get to evaluate, prioritize, and categorize these items and trying to see what is really important. Again, just like the previous phase with the mission and vision, it's important to have a strategic plan that has big ideas, but that are also voted on. So having red and green stickers, voting on what they like and don't like, giving everybody 4 greens and 4 red stickers, 1 for each committee, and understanding and voting for what is the ranked or ranked choice items. There's 1,000,001 options on how you can do ranked choice, but it's really important to make sure that there's a voting process of this. The big ideas are a really kind of the bottom of the pyramid. These are what you're going to go after over the next couple of years. And these are going to be the big goals as to what the community needs to do. The final phases is all about the paperwork and the goal determination. This is where things really kind of hit the brass tacks and get down to the nitty gritty. In this final phase, you're typically going to set the strategic goals, do your action planning or your detailed planning for your work groups, and create an implementation matrix. The goal of this is to set a clear direction and have something that the group can move forward with. Phase 6 is about creating supportive strategies. Supportive strategies is more about how do you add a logical workflow or a logical progression of order to implementing those big ideas. So this is a group exercise where this workflow is created and you outline the actual steps as to, let's give an example, add lights to a bridge to add color or creativity. This is one of the items where you would say there's a design process, there's a review process, there's a funding process, and you create a logical flow in these supportive strategies. It is important during this phase that people start to swap groups. If you're doing this as a group exercise, the groups really should swap committees or groups at this time to make sure that everybody's thought through the different angles. Having a fresh set of eyes, creating these workflows is really important to making sure everybody understands it and it's not just one person's collective vision for what that workflow would be. The supportive strategies, there's typically 3 to 4 for each big idea, and those get further broken down at the next phase of the process. But it's important to review this as a group as well. So after everybody's broken into groups and come back, have a presentation, have people stand up and say what they came up with. gather their feedback, create and fill in these worksheets, have the documentation be ready for what people need to fill in, and move forward with the action planning. Phase 7 is where you break each one of those strategies that was just created into specific action items. This is about creating the actionable tasks that each committee or working board is going to do. Now, for many communities, this is where there's typically a split in the process. And the split in the process is if you have 4 working committees, this is where it typically gets handed off to those 4 committees to create the work plans, and they adopt those and ship them back to the board for approval. If you don't have 4 working committees, this may be the working board completing these action or work plans and having that item be prepared and approved. That's typically where this split will happen. However, either way, no matter which group does this, strategic planning and creating the action items is all about refining the workflow into detailed, bite-sized elements that have resources allocated to each. So the workbook has worksheets to be filled in with filling in 4 to 6 action items for each strategy. And once those are done, it is really about filling in and saying, I need this much money. I need these types of volunteers. I need this help from whatever committee it may be. We need to identify a grant. You list the resources needed, how long they're going to take, and who's going to achieve it. This is about building responsibility through a roles and responsibilities type of matrix, but it's also about allocating the resources accordingly. Everybody in this call is a Main Street manager and understands that your time is limited. So this is the opportunity where the manager and the board get to sit down and have that tough discussion about how do, as a group, we work together to achieve these goals, and how do we split up this work so it's not all piled on the director's job. One of the items that should come out of this is actionable plans that are very easy to follow, that have months or quarters listed to them, that have resources determined, so everybody can plan accordingly, make sure that everything's in order. And if there's any holdups in the process, you'll either see what process before has held it up or what you're doing as part of the working group that may not have been right to keep that completed. This step is often for many people called your annual work plans. And again, this could be done by the board if your working board, or it can be done by the committees accordingly. The last step of the process is phase 8, which is the compilation or pulling all this together into an actionable document or a strategic plan document. With the workbook, you will get a template that you're welcome to use in PowerPoint format that clearly outlines the big ideas for a long and a short term, and then the strategic goals and recommendations for a long and a short term, and then the action items for each long and short term as well. The format's ready for also listing the assets, the resources that are available, and all the items. It's truly meant to be a template that can be filled in and changed and amended as the groups will need. This is also where you start to not just fill in that form, but finalize the strategic plan and start making plans for how this is going to actually get implemented and put in place. So it's important in phase 8 to talk through what are the elements that you need to activate, who's going to take on each role, and setting timeframes and hard dates for those types of items. So those are the 8 phases of the strategic planning workbook. And the process is not to be a laborious one, but to be an interactive one with exercise materials, the engagement worksheets. We'll have educational webinars, and we are available to answer questions if you get stuck on something. Overall, this workbook is meant to be a guide. It's meant to help the community and the organization funnel through and answer your questions and undertake a strategic plan that is not necessarily led by a consultant. Something that is really led by the locals, for the locals, and understanding what the locals need. Because coming from a consultant, the best people in town are your locals. They know what they can do, they know what they can offer, and it's really important to make sure that that's what's being offered. Through the workbook, you will also get the opportunity to understand how this all links together, have the interactive templates, the documents, the forms, everything's ready for you. It's delivered in either a print form or a Google Drive. If you only want one copy of the workbook, we're happy to print one out and mail it to you. If you want to use this over time or make multiple copies, we would recommend the PDF format where we can ship it to you via email or Google Drive or a OneDrive. And you can retrieve them and drop them and copy them as you need. And I think that's where we'll pause and we'll say, are there any questions? Nathan, did you have any questions come up?
There are no questions in the chat. If you
Okay.
do have a question, you're welcome to say it out loud, or you can pop it in the chat and we'll read it out.
We'll give people a minute or two to see if anything pops up. Overall, the hope is that the workbook would be an efficient tool for this, for everyone to be part of the strategic planning process. And what we will say is, if there are any questions, please do reach out to us. You can get a hold of us at the office account, office@dtredevelopment.com, or you can go to our website, dtredevelopment.com, and find more information about this. And we're able to answer any questions you have, talk through the process, and help identify what would be best for you, whether it is a workbook, whether it is guided consulting, whether it is a consultant-led strategic plan, whatever it may be. Typically, we have 3 tiered items to this, kind of outlined here on the screen. The self-paced workbook, $5.95. The virtual moderation or moderating. This is where there's a virtual prompter that will help with 3 1 or 2 hour meetings, help your board through the process, understand what it is. We can also provide you with the stickers, the sticky notes, the workbooks, the copies, all the things that you would need to help through this. But we're there to help guide through the challenging parts and the challenging phases as you would see fit or request for help. And then strategic planning for on-site does start at 5,000. But again, this workbook is meant to be more of a tool where people can have this discussion and take care of it themselves. We know not every community can afford that, so we wanted to come up with something that every community could afford, and that's where the workbook that's self-paced really came out. Gabriella, looks like you have a question. You're welcome to unmute and ask, or if you'd rather type in the chat, that's fine too.
Hi, I thought I'd just jump in with a quick question. I
Sure.
think you mentioned at some point that there is, what you would recommend, what I would call, homework before the actual, actually, this is for the rapid, the intensive kind of
Yes.
2-day strategic planning. I believe you said you recommend homework or prep work in order to get this done in 2 days.
Correct.
And is that something that you do, or you recommend people on their own, or do you interview folks before an event?
So I would say it's both. The answer is yes and yes. Not to confuse you, but you will need to do a little bit of introspective and understand what's available to you, what you're planning, and from a director or a board's role, what's worked and what hasn't, because you guys tend to know a little bit of the background, right? Some things the public may not know. But it's also good to do a public facing side of it and understand what the public thinks of your organization, whether you're hitting the right targets or whether you're hitting the right metrics. And so you likely are going to want to do that ahead of time for both of those groups. And you're right, it's kind of a little bit of homework, but the reason it's important to do that process is not to just have to do homework, but more importantly, to understand what has been successful and what has not. Because what you're going to find as you go through the strategic plan is you probably, if you have not defined your metrics of what success is, there's going to be a variety of what people term successful and what was not.
And to add to that, we do provide worksheets in that early phase 0, as we call it, that help guide you through the asset identification, those surveys, and then the plan review.
Right. So that is the prep work. There are some, you need to get feedback from the core folks. In some cases, strategic planning in some smaller places is just done by the board and the volunteers, but I guess there's also some other types of planning that you would get involved where the larger community comes on board. And I guess that's the one that takes, well, certainly it's got to take longer.
Yeah, it does, but if you have the time, it's definitely worthwhile. But if you don't have time, that may not be something you do, but it would be a great item to add into your strategic planning, your action items, to do a community forum and learn more.
Right. then it would be something, something on the to-do list. If that, you're not there. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah, okay, got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? Okay. Well, with no other questions, we'll turn everybody loose. This recording will be live again tomorrow on the DT redevelopment website. And then if there are any questions, the interim, feel free to reach out. I believe Nathan put the contact information in the chat, and we can happily answer questions for anybody through the process.